Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a spaniel in pastels. Now this video is going to focus primarily on how to draw brown fur, and the first thing that I want to be focusing on here is my contrast. Now this here is very important, so regardless of the fur colour, the contrast and how we're building up those values is very important. So what I'll be working with here for this portrait is just with my pastel pencils to show that you can create that photorealistic drawing just with the pencils alone. You don't need to have all of the pan pastels or lots of soft pastel sticks. You can just create highly detailed photorealistic work with the pencils on their own. Now as I work with a base layer here, you can really see how I'm mapping in my main lights and darks right from the beginning. I am being very confident with the way that I'm putting that darker layer in, and that's very important. Quite often the base layers aren't made dark enough. Now what that will do is it will significantly limit the amount of depth that is created going forward in the portrait. So if that base layer isn't dark enough, the fur will look flat. So for this I want to be making sure that I've got that dark enough so that I've already achieved really good contrast early on. Now once I was happy with that base layer, I'm going to then focus on the first layer of detail. Now I like to work in small sections and I get those areas about 80% complete and then I move on. The detailing that I'm applying here is all about reinforcing the structure of the face. Now the pencil technique when we start working with the details relies on three main things. So that's fur direction, fur length and fur thickness. Those three things are going to make a real difference in terms of how realistic that animal is going to be captured. So the fur direction's not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. Now something else that's as important as the fur direction is the placement of the highlights and shadows. So as you can see here, I'm starting to build up those subtle highlights over the top of the eye here, and that's helping to reinforce the shape of the eye socket and where that joins on to the side of the skull. All of these things here are very important to capture, and I really do like to build this up in stages to help maximise the depth that's achieved. Now when drawing brown fur, it's really important to pay attention to these subtle colour changes. So you can see here that I'm actually using quite a few pinks and purples throughout the layering process. Now this is something that I cover thoroughly in this chocolate Labrador tutorial pictured in the corner, where that is all in real time. I'm explaining the voiceover while I'm drawing, so every single decision regarding the technique, the layering process, the colour selection is all explained in the moment. If that tutorial there is of interest, I'll link my Patreon in the description below. But in terms of the colours that I'm using here, of course that's going to vary depending on the lighting of that reference photo. So if the dog was photographed inside compared to outside, those colours that we're going to be using on the coat will vary. Now the colour selection process is something that I'm asked more than any other question. How to pick the pencils based on the reference photo that we're looking at is something that I do cover thoroughly in my Patreon tutorials. The colour selection process, it can in some cases be made more complex than it needs to be. We start to overthink the process more than we should. So I do have a simple colour wheel system method that's explained in my real-time tutorials, where it really helps to isolate and really significantly reduce what colours we should be using. If we've got maybe 50 pencils in front of us, it can be very difficult to know which one to go for. So by having a simple method in place, it can help to eliminate all of that stress when knowing which pencils we should be using. Now onto one of the core elements of any portrait, and that's the nose. Now when drawing realistic noses, I just focus on the shapes that I see. So I'll always map in the nostrils first. That's one of those main things that you do want to make sure that you get right. If the size of the nostrils or the placement of the nostrils are not right, it's very obvious. So I want to be making sure that that's accurate before I move on. Once I'm happy with that, as you can see here, I'm just reinforcing the lights and the darks exactly as I would with the fur. I want to be paying very close attention to those subtle layers, and if there's any real bright highlights, it's always worthwhile potentially to map that in first with a white pencil. Just so you know you've got that really bright highlight there, and then you can always darken that up later if you need to. Now when working on the bridge of the nose, this is one area where the fur direction is typically much shorter than on most breeds compared to the rest of the face. The exception of course would be something maybe like a cockapoo, where they've still got that longer fur that comes over the side of the mouth. But for breeds such as this, Spaniels, Labradors, German Shepherds, the fur on the bridge of the nose here as it goes up towards the eyes is usually significantly shorter than anywhere else. So I want to be making sure that I'm adjusting the pencil strokes. If I don't shorten my pencil strokes for this section of the face, then this will start to look fluffy. So of course this is something that's not typical of this breed, so I want to be paying very close attention to fur direction and the length of those pencil strokes. Now the thickness of my pencil strokes, that's determined by a couple of things. So the sharpness of the lead, how much pressure we're applying, and even how we're holding and moving the pencil. All of those factors will affect all of the fur direction, the fur thickness and the fur length. So how we use the pencils again is something that I do cover thoroughly in those Patreon tutorials. Now going back to the base layer here, look at how I'm really reinforcing the position of the lights and the darks, but I make sure that it's fairly blended before I move on to my details. This here is a fundamental process. I put a lot of emphasis on my base layer stage because this is the foundation for our details. I don't just like to put in a solid colour and then jump into my highlights or my details from there. I find that you're going to end up getting far more of a flatter fur if that's the case. Whereas I want to be putting in that softness in that base layer and then building up those multiple layers as I go. Now again, the biggest tip with drawing fur, doesn't matter what it is you don't want to jump to your brightest highlights first. You want to save those for your later layers because those highlights are sitting on the very top, so it does make sense to leave those until those later stages. Now one thing that I want to mention about the base layer stage is filling the tooth of the paper. Now filling the tooth of the paper is a question that I'm asked fairly frequently, and what happens with that is if you come back in with your pastel pencils on top of your base layer and you feel like your pencils are just gliding over the surface, the pigment is not really showing up, the pencil strokes are not there, that's an indication that the tooth of the paper has been filled. Now obviously that is going to significantly limit what that portrait is going to look like if you can't add details on top. So what I would recommend to do, as the portrait isn't finished at that stage, I would use a workable fixative and spray some of that onto your portrait so that you restore some of the tooth of the paper. Once that's done, you can then go back in with your pastel pencils. Now in terms of using a workable fixative, there are a couple of things to bear in mind. A fixative will adjust the colour of your portrait so far, but if you're using it as a workable fixative to apply tooth back to the paper, that portrait's not finished, that's not so much of an issue. If it means you haven't got to start that portrait again, then a workable fixative is worth trying. Now when you do use a workable fixative, I would recommend to use lighter layers rather than one heavy layer. Using a heavy layer of fixative, as it is liquid of some kind over the top, you don't want to end up saturating the paper. That can cause real issues, and I've experienced it before where it's almost like the details just dissolved. So I would recommend to use one or two lighter layers, try to come back in with your pastel pencils, and if you need to do another layer then you can. But you want to be making sure that that fixative layer is completely dry before you start using your pencils. I would also recommend to hold that fixative spray bottle further away from your surface, so again you don't end up with too much fixative in one area. Hold that further away, even if it's 1.5 foot away from your paper, so that you've got a nice distance from that to evenly disperse that spray, so that again you just don't end up with any one section of that paper that's become too wet. Now I do find working with the pastel pencils like this, I don't ever feel that there's a risk of filling the tooth of the paper. I've added lots of layers here and I could still have come back and added more if I needed to. But because pan pastel pigment is significantly softer, that is something that we need to pay more attention to at that base layer stage. Now I've got lots of videos here on YouTube where I am using pan pastels for my base layer, and of course there I share information, top tips on how to avoid filling the tooth of the paper. Now when I worked on the mouth section here, you'll notice that I accidentally forgot to draw in the back teeth. That there I realised at the end of the portrait, and I completed that at the very last stage when I added the whiskers. But when drawing mouths, it's really important, I feel, to just focus on the shapes that you see. So because of the way that the light hits those wetter sections of the mouth, it can actually make the mouth take on a very odd shape, especially where the gum starts to lean over. So just focus on your lights and your darks, get the position of those accurate, and then before you know it, once you're at this stage, it looks more realistic. but sometimes when drawing a mouth in between those work in progress stages, it doesn't look like that reference photo much at all. Just break it up into small sections, do the teeth individually, do the tongue, then the gums. Try not to block it all in with one solid base layer and then work from there, because before we know it, some of those sections can get lost or merged together, and then the mouth can take on a little bit more of a funny shape. So I like to break it up into each individual element, and then before I know it, when I'm at this stage, it looks like that reference photo. Now, my biggest tip when working on the very last element of a portrait like this, that chest section, it's really important to give this the right amount of time that it needs. In some cases, we might feel that it's not as important as the face and we start to rush it. Now, if that happens, this area of the portrait will bring down all of the work that's been put into drawing the face of that animal. So I do really want to be making sure that if needed, I've taken a break after drawing the face and before starting the chest. Then I know I'm working with fresh eyes, I'm not going to have as much of a tendency to rush. And that will make a huge difference to how realistic this portrait looks when finished. So I do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading a video at the end of the week, but if you are interested in my step-by-step real-time tutorials, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching.